The cameras waited first. Santa Monica, October 1973. Reporters lined the steps of the courthouse, lenses aimed at a door that had not opened yet, waiting to catch the exact moment the king walked in to end his marriage. Microphones hovered in the air, voices tangled over each other. A crowd wanted one thing more than anything else that day: a clear picture of Elvis Presley's face. What they did not expect was what happened when he saw hers. Elvis stepped out of the car slower than usual. The swagger was still there, but the edges had softened. Fame had added weight to his body and worry to his eyes. He adjusted his collar as if he was about to walk on stage, not into a room where a judge would sign away the life he had tried to build. Noise rolled over him. People shouted his name. Flash bulbs exploded in quick white bursts. Then another car door shut behind him. Priscilla walked toward the steps with a kind of careful grace, as if every movement had been measured before she left the house. Her clothes were simple, her hair was neat. On the outside, she looked composed. On the inside, a storm pressed against a very thin wall. For the cameras, it was just another shot to capture. For Elvis, it was a collision with an entire lifetime. He saw her face. Not the public version on magazine covers, not the posed wife beside him in a formal photograph. For a heartbeat, the woman in front of him looked like the girl from a living room in Germany all those years ago. Her eyes were softer than they had any right to be on a day like this. There was sadness there. There was acceptance. There was something that, for him, still felt like home. His reaction was immediate. Before lawyers could whisper, before security could move, Elvis walked straight toward her. He did not pause. He did not hesitate. He reached for her hand as if there were no cameras at all, pulled her close, and kissed her on the steps of the courthouse that would make them legally strangers. The world saw a headline. Fans saw proof that they still loved each other. Reporters called it a gracious gesture, a gentleman's farewell, a media moment. They missed what was really happening inside that instant. Because for Elvis, that kiss did not start in Santa Monica. It started in a crowded living room in Germany, in a teenage girl's quiet smile, in 10,000 nights when he had looked at her face and reacted before he even knew he was doing it. To understand why he moved so fast that morning, why his body made a decision his mind was not ready to make, you have to go back to the first time Elvis Presley ever saw Priscilla Beaulieu's face and felt his world tilt without a single song playing. Germany, 1959. A cold evening wrapped itself around the small town outside the American base, but inside the house, the air was warm with chatter. Officers, family members, and a few lucky friends filled the living room. There were plates on the table, polite laughter, and the quiet hum of people trying very hard not to stare at the most famous soldier in the room. Elvis sat near the middle of it, in uniform, hair tamed by army regulations, but still unmistakably his. He laughed when he was supposed to laugh, answered questions about home, about Memphis, about the movies. His voice was polite. His smile was professional. To most people there, he looked like a young man adjusting well to military life. Inside, he felt like a stranger who had walked too far away from himself. His mother was gone. Hollywood had turned his life into a product. The screaming crowds had vanished overnight, replaced by early mornings, drills, and a bunk that felt more like escape than punishment. He had everything people dreamed about, and somehow he had never felt more alone. Conversation moved around him like a river he was sitting beside, not inside. A plate clinked in the kitchen. A door opened, something shifted in the room. Elvis looked up. A girl had just walked in. Dark hair, schoolgirl clothes, a face that did not belong to the noise of that room. She was only 14, and every part of her knew it. Her shoulders were a little too tense. Her hands held onto themselves as if they needed somewhere to hide. Her eyes, though her eyes looked older. Other guests looked at her as the daughter of an officer. Elvis looked at her as if someone had just walked in carrying a quiet secret. For a moment, the room fell away. He noticed how she watched everything without trying to be seen herself. She did not chase his attention. She did not giggle in the obvious way some did around him. She stood at the edge of the conversation, listening, trying to decide where she fit. Something inside him softened. He shifted in his chair, not to pose, but to get a better angle. That small movement changed the rest of his night. When someone finally introduced them, he spoke differently than he had with anyone else that evening. His voice dropped to a gentler tone. The jokes became less sharp, more sincere. The famous grin came out, but this time it was not for an audience. It was for her. Priscilla answered carefully, voice quiet but steady. She said simple things about school, about living so far from the United States, about missing her friends. Each answer came with a tiny flicker in her eyes, a silent layer underneath the words. He saw sadness there when she mentioned leaving her old life. He saw curiosity when he mentioned gospel songs. He saw something like disbelief when she realized this superstar was asking her questions as if her thoughts actually mattered. Every time her face changed, his chest tightened a little. Other people in the room saw a famous guest making small talk with a teenager. Elvis felt something else, something he could not yet name. In that small, borrowed living room in Germany, he found a face that did not ask him to be Elvis Presley. It just asked him to be someone who listened. When the night ended, she had to leave before everyone else. Rules, curfews, the boundaries of a young girl's life. She picked up her coat, said polite goodbyes, and moved toward the door. Elvis watched her go. As she turned for one last, quick look over her shoulder, their eyes met. For half a second, there was no rank, no fame, no age difference. There were just two people who had found an unexpected piece of home far away from everything they knew. That half second hit him harder than any applause he had ever heard. After she left, the room felt louder and emptier at the same time. He laughed with the remaining guests, posed for a few photos, thanked his hosts. Inside, his mind replayed that last glance over and over, like a record that had only one groove. When duty pulled him back to base life, the memory stayed. On long nights, when the barracks were quiet and everyone else slept, he would lie awake and see her face again in the dark. The shy smile, the uncertain confidence, the way her eyes seemed to understand something about hurt without asking questions about it. Letters started passing between them. What began as careful, supervised contact slowly turned into a thread that he clung to when the noise of the outside world became too heavy. She wrote about school days and family dinners. He wrote about music, about his hopes for when service ended, about the parts of himself that did not fit on a movie poster. Photos moved with the letters, small, stiff prints that he studied as if they were maps. In each new photograph, her features matured a little, but the eyes stayed the same, that quiet depth, that habit of watching the room rather than chasing it. Those pictures lived in drawers, in pockets, in suitcases. Long after he left Germany, long after fans screamed for him again in theaters and concert halls, he would sit alone and look at those images when the weight of the world felt impossible. Somewhere in the middle of all the bright lights and loud crowds, the idea formed, not just of a girl he liked, but of a life he wanted. A home that was not a hotel suite, a face he could return to that did not change with the charts. When Priscilla finally came to the United States and stepped into his world at Graceland, the idea met reality. Cars had changed, clothes had changed, hairstyles were bigger, more polished, more camera-ready. Fame had wrapped tighter around his life, and the house on the hill had become a kingdom with rules, expectations, and unspoken pressure. She stepped through the doors of Graceland with a mix of wonder and fear. Every surface gleamed. Staff moved in patterns that had nothing to do with her. As she stood in the middle of it all, Elvis looked at her and searched for the girl from Germany. He found her in the nervous bite of her lip. He found her in the way she held her hands together when too many people stared. He found her in the way her face relaxed only when everyone else left the room. Praise from others bounced off him. Respect from the guys in his inner circle kept the machine running. The look on Priscilla's face when they were alone told him whether he still had a piece of the boy he used to be. At first, life inside Graceland felt like a fairy tale written by a very famous pen. There were late-night talks in dim rooms, records spinning, plans whispered about a future that belonged to them alone. He would catch her laughing at something small and simple, and in that laugh he heard echoes of the girl in Germany. Slowly, the fairy tale sprouted cracks. Schedules tightened, tour and films demanded more of his time, and the more his public swallowed him, the more he tried to control the little corner of life he called his own. Curfews, rules, expectations about how she should look, where she should be, who she should see. He told himself it was protection. She heard the bars of a cage beginning to close. The change showed up on her face before it ever became a fight. In the early years, when he walked into a room, her expression used to lift, as if the air had grown lighter. Later, there were days when he came home and found a different look waiting for him, a half smile that did not reach all the way up, eyes that flinched when someone made a crude joke, a softness wrapped around a growing hard line. He could still make her laugh. He could still light up her features with a grand gesture or a surprise gift. What he could not erase were the quiet, in-between moments when she thought no one was watching. Servants saw her sit alone at a window, face turned toward a driveway that stayed empty. Friends noticed how she fell silent when the boys planned another night that did not include her. Elvis walked through his own house and caught flashes of her reflection in mirrors, studying herself like someone trying to remember who she was before all of this. One night before another long stretch of shows, the tension hung over Graceland like a storm that refused to break. Suitcases waited in the hall. Phone calls about business crackled through the house. The guys joked in the next room, filling the silence with chatter. Elvis stood in the doorway of a quiet room and saw her sitting alone, framed by the soft glow of a lamp. Her face gave her away. There was no makeup that could hide the exhaustion, no perfect hairstyle that could soften the sorrow. Her eyes held fear that he would be gone too long again, and fear that he would come back exactly the same when he did. He walked in and tried to turn the mood with charm. Promises spilled out easily. He said they would take a trip when the shows were over. He said he would slow down soon. He said the things he knew a husband was supposed to say when his wife looked like that. She listened quietly, her mouth curved up when he made a joke, her head nodded when he made plans for later. Her eyes did not change. For a moment he saw it, clearly and without excuse, the look of someone who loved him and could not breathe in the life that love had become. That look stabbed deeper than any harsh word. He stepped back from it. Instead of staying with that truth, he reached for the old tools, a bigger promise, a brighter dream, a kiss meant to silence the questions that floated between them. Later would fix it, later would be kinder, later would give him time to be the man she needed. Later did not come the way he imagined. Years later, on the steps of that courthouse in Santa Monica, Elvis Presley saw that same face again. This time, when his body reacted faster than his thoughts, the world watched. What began in a quiet room in Germany and grew inside the walls of Graceland finally showed itself in one public, decisive, irreversible moment. And once again, everything in his life shifted because of the way Priscilla looked at him. By the end of the 1960s, the world thought Elvis Presley had won himself back. The comeback special had lit him up on television in a way that reminded older fans why they had fallen in love with him in the first place. New audiences saw a man who still moved like trouble and sang like a prayer. Black leather wrapped around him, sweat shone on his face, energy crackled off the screen. Crowds cheered as if the lost boy from the movies had finally come home. Inside, something very different was happening. The show had given him proof that the old fire still burned, but it also demanded a new kind of price. Success meant more meetings, more plans, more people who wanted a piece of him. He felt both reborn and more trapped than ever before. Priscilla watched that transformation from a distance that kept changing. Some nights she sat in the audience, close enough to see every bead of sweat. Some nights she stood off to the side, watching a version of her husband that belonged to everyone and no one. Other nights she was not there at all, listening to reports secondhand, hearing about flirtations, parties, and after-hours gatherings that had very little to do with marriage. Her face began to carry two different stories. When cameras pointed in her direction, a polished wife smiled beside a legend. Her posture was perfect. Her eyes softened for the photographers. To the public, they looked like a dream that had survived the pressure of fame. When the doors shut and the crowd disappeared, that same face told a different truth. Worry carved faint lines at the edge of her eyes. Disappointment hovered in the way her mouth settled when she was alone. The laughter that used to come quickly now had to be pulled out of her, and only in moments when guards had slipped and she forgot she was supposed to be fine. Elvis saw both versions. At first he told himself that the second face would fade when things calmed down. One more run of shows, one more film, one more business move. Then he would slow down and the girl from Germany would shine through again. Things did not calm down. More offers arrived. Bigger stages called. Las Vegas opened its neon arms. Vegas looked like a chance to control everything. Instead of endless travel, he would own one room, one stage, one city, night after night. The money was huge. The stage was built to flatter him. The contract promised stability. It also created a new prison. Shows stretched late into the night. Rehearsals filled the days. Adrenaline demanded company when the curtains closed. Pills helped him sleep, then pills helped him wake up. The world inside those hotels blurred at the edges. Priscilla walked into that world and saw a version of her life that did not match what she had once imagined. Casino lights stole the stars from the sky. People brushed past her in lobbies without really seeing her. In rooms filled with smoke and noise, she watched men and women lean toward her husband as if he were the only real thing in the building. He thrilled crowds. He poured himself into each performance. He reached for fans from the edge of the stage. Every time he did, a tiny thread tightened around her chest. At first she tried to carry it quietly. She woke with him when he needed company before a show. She stayed up late when he returned wired and restless. She listened to his frustrations about management, about critics, about his own fear that the magic might vanish if he missed a beat. Gradually, a new feeling came in. Resentment did not arrive as a storm. It crept in like a fog, hiding landmarks. When another woman's name came up one too many times, when a joke about his options around town drew too much laughter, a part of her withdrew. She smiled less easily. She chose silence over arguments that never changed anything. Elvis noticed that silence more than any shouted complaint. He had grown up around women who said exactly what they thought. His mother, his aunts, the church ladies in Memphis, they all spoke their minds. Priscilla's quiet cut deeper. A loud accusation could be defended. A still face that held back its pain could not be argued with. After one particular show, he came back to the suite still high from the crowd. People praised him as he walked down the hallway. Members of his inner circle slapped his shoulders, told him he had never sounded better, offered him drinks and jokes. Inside the private room, the noise fell away. Priscilla stood near a table, arms folded loosely, watching him. Her eyes studied him, not as a fan, not as a woman dazzled by a superstar, but as someone who had shared his bed, his disappointments, his impossible promises. There was pride in her gaze. There was also something steely that worried him. He kissed her cheek, waiting for the automatic smile that had softened things in the past. The smile appeared, but it was thinner than he remembered. A question formed in his chest that he did not want to say out loud. The next day, when she suggested activities that did not revolve around the showroom or his schedule, his reaction came from that unspoken fear. He brushed her off with a joke at first. When she pressed a little, confusion flickered across his face, then annoyance. The room filled with the invisible weight of all the times she had bent her life around his needs. She felt it, he felt it. Neither of them knew how to cut through it without drawing blood. Back in Memphis, the pattern followed them home. Graceland had once been their refuge. In those early days, the house meant privacy and shared secrets. Now it meant routines that no longer fit either of them. Elvis slept odd hours. Phone calls interrupted meals. Friends drifted in and out at all hours of the night. Priscilla started looking for pieces of herself outside of his shadow. Karate entered her life as more than a hobby. It gave her strength, movement, and a sense of control over her own body in a world where people often handled her like part of someone else's property. Training pushed her to focus on discipline and self-respect. Elvis watched her involvement grow and felt a mix of emotions. Part of him admired her focus. Another part saw a threat. He had grown used to being the center of gravity in every room he entered. The idea that she might find empowerment through a path he did not own shook him. Each time she came back from a session looking energized in a way that had nothing to do with him, he felt a sharp sting in his pride. He masked it with teasing remarks, with playful jabs that did not always land as light as he meant them. A new expression appeared on her face then. There were moments when she looked at him and he could see two things at once: the love that had brought her into his world and the awareness that staying there might cost her everything she was slowly discovering about herself. Friends noticed that she carried herself with more certainty. Observers saw a woman finding her own identity. Elvis saw something else as well. He saw the risk that the girl who had always waited for him might decide that waiting was no longer her role. That thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. So he tried what had worked before: grand gestures, lavish gifts, sudden bursts of tenderness. Each one created a momentary glow on her face, followed by the same shadow when everyday life resumed. The gap between those flashes grew wider. Arguments began to surface that had stayed buried for years, about time, about loyalty, about respect, about the difference between loving someone and being allowed to live beside him as a full person and not a symbol. The first serious fight that did not fade away started over something small. Maybe it was a careless comment. Maybe it was a late arrival home after promising to be back early. Whatever the trigger, words spilled out on both sides that had been waiting for an excuse to escape. Priscilla spoke about loneliness. She spoke about feeling like a guest in her own life. She spoke about the constant sense that he chose everything else first and her last. Elvis fired back with his own frustrations. He talked about pressure. He talked about responsibilities that came with being who he was. He talked about the sacrifices he had made for his family and his fans. Underneath all the surface arguments lay one raw question neither of them could quite ask. Was the love that had started in that German living room strong enough to survive the version of Elvis Presley the world now demanded? Nights followed where they barely spoke. Days passed in which practical matters about Lisa and the house acted as their only form of communication. Each conversation became a negotiation, each silence a verdict neither wanted to deliver. Through it all, her face told him the truth before her words did. He saw the moment she stopped expecting him to change. He saw the moment she began to look past him instead of through him, as if measuring a future that no longer depended on his decisions. He saw a calm settle over her features that felt more dangerous than anger. One evening, the air in the house carried the weight of a decision already made. Lisa played in another room. The sound of her voice drifted through the hall. Elvis walked toward the bedroom, heart pounding for reasons he did not fully understand. He had spoken to Priscilla earlier that day and felt a strange distance in the way she answered simple questions. When he stepped into the room, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on a point in front of her that had nothing to do with any object in the space. She looked up when she heard him, and the look on her face stopped him cold. There were no tears yet. There was no dramatic outburst. Instead, there was a quiet firmness, the expression of someone who had already crossed a line inside herself and was now simply informing the rest of the world. She took a breath, the kind that gathers courage. Words followed that he had always feared and never expected to actually hear. She said that she could not live like this any longer. She said that the constant uncertainty, the long absences, the rumors, and the feeling of being an accessory rather than a partner had worn her down. She said that she needed to find out who she was when she was not orbiting his life. His mind scrambled for tools. Charm came first. He reminded her of their memories. He painted pictures of things they would do as a family. He promised that he would cut back on shows, that he would fix his habits, that he would make more time. Her eyes softened with recognition of the man she had loved, but that new steadiness did not break. Pride came next. He raised his voice, not in screams, but in wounded frustration. He spoke about his own sacrifices. He asked how she could consider leaving after everything they had been through. He questioned her loyalty. He reminded her of the times he had chosen her over other possibilities. That steadiness remained. Despair followed behind. The idea of a world in which she was not waiting at the other end of his road hit him with a force he had not prepared for. His words stumbled. He told her he needed her. He told her the house would be empty without her. He told her that no one knew him the way she did. For a moment, pain flashed across her face. It was the old pain, the shared sorrow of two people who had once clung to each other against the world. Then the expression shifted back to resolve. She was tired of hearing who he could be. She needed to live with who he actually was. Silence settled between them like a thick blanket. In that silence, he realized something that shook him more than anything she had said out loud. For the first time, he was not in control of what happened next. He could not call a manager to negotiate this. He could not reschedule. He could not charm an audience back into a good mood. The choice belonged to the woman sitting on the edge of the bed, who had once walked shyly into a living room in Germany. When she finally rose to her feet, the movement was simple, but the message carried the weight of years. She said that she was leaving, not to play a game, not to manipulate him, to save herself. He watched her walk past him, every step a history lesson. The girl who had followed him into an unknown life was now stepping out of a life that no longer fit. She walked down the hallway toward a future he would not control. Her shoulders stayed straight, her head did not turn back. He stood rooted to the floor, listening to the sounds that marked the end of a chapter he had assumed would last forever. A drawer closed, a suitcase moved, a door opened and shut. Lisa's voice echoed faintly from another room, unaware that the shape of her family had just shifted in a way that could never fully be undone. When the house grew quiet again, Elvis stood alone in the space where his marriage had finally cracked all the way through. He could still see the look on Priscilla's face when she told him she was leaving. That look would mark him more deeply than any critic's review. The next time he saw that face, it would be on the steps of a courthouse with the whole world watching. Living apart looked simple on paper. Legal documents named addresses. Custody schedules laid out days and holidays in tidy lines. Lawyers spoke about fairness, support, and structure, as if a family could be turned into a clean chart and filed away. Real life did not obey those charts. In the months after Priscilla left, every exchange of Lisa became its own small storm. A phone call would set the time. A car would pull into a driveway. A child would go from one world into another, carrying pieces of both in her small hands. Elvis tried to focus on the moments that still felt normal. When Lisa ran toward him with her arms open, his whole body relaxed. Laughter came easier in those first minutes. Her stories about school, about friends, about small adventures filled the air and pushed the ache to the edges of the room. Eventually her words ran out and her attention shifted. Questions about home followed. Questions about routines at her mother's house slipped in between talk of toys and movies. A new pattern formed that Elvis could not ignore. Priscilla was building a life with their daughter, without him at the center. Every time Lisa mentioned something she had done with her mother that did not include him, a part of him rebelled. No stage could prepare him for the feeling of being an occasional guest in his own child's memories. Pride in Priscilla's care for their daughter mixed with a sharp, private jealousy he rarely admitted even to himself. Conversations with Priscilla during these handovers stayed polite. Voices remained measured. Smiles appeared when Lisa looked up at them. As soon as the car door shut, each adult expired a separate breath they had been holding. Tension did not always show in raised voices. Sometimes it lived in what they did not say. In front of their child, they worked hard to be gentle. Away from her, each carried their own version of what had gone wrong. His version carried the weight of a dream that had slipped away. Hers carried the weight of years spent trying to fit into that dream. Work did not slow down to let him heal. Stage lights still switched on at showtime, bands still tuned up, audiences still filed into seats, hungry for the sound and presence they had paid to see. Managers still counted tickets and watched numbers. Contracts still waited for signatures in neat stacks. On stage, Elvis gave them what they came for. Music still poured out with force, eyes still locked onto faces in the crowd, hands still reached out over the edge of the stage. To those who only saw him under lights, the king looked intact, still roaring, still untouchable. Back in dressing rooms and hallways, cracks widened. Exhaustion sat heavy on his shoulders. Medication schedules grew more complicated. Food became comfort and armor. The mirror reflected a man he sometimes did not recognize, a man who carried the memory of a young soldier in Germany inside a body now stiff with strain. Public praise echoed, private thoughts grew darker. Newspaper stories framed him as a legend with an exciting Vegas chapter. Gossip columns speculated about his love life. Rumors swirled about women who came and went, about late-night calls, about attempts to fill a space that had once held a single constant presence. None of those stories described the simple truth that haunted him most nights. Silence in a house where Priscilla no longer walked made him feel smaller than any bad review ever had. Old photos stayed close. Drawers held evidence of earlier versions of his life. Wedding pictures, candid shots at Graceland, snapshots of Lisa as a baby with both parents smiling at her, all lay scattered in quiet rooms. Each image trapped a face from a moment he could not go back to. One particular photograph drew him again and again. The angle was simple. Priscilla stood slightly turned, eyes lifted toward something outside the frame, smile relaxed and unguarded. The image captured her before the routines of Las Vegas, before the long arguments, before the decision to leave. He studied that picture and wondered when exactly that expression had changed in front of him without him noticing. Time moved forward, whether he wanted it to or not. Legal steps that had started as distant possibilities moved closer. Papers required signatures. Meetings with attorneys broke his days into pieces filled with language he did not care about. Words like settlement and decree and dissolution appeared on forms that would eventually define what the world already knew in their hearts. A date for the divorce hearing was set. Santa Monica sat far from Memphis and Germany and all the places where their story had started and grown, yet that California courtroom would hold the final official word on their marriage. The thought of standing beside her in that space twisted his insides into knots he could not untangle. The night before that hearing arrived with a weight he could not shake off. Rooms felt too large and too small at the same time. Friends moved carefully around him, unsure how close to stand. Jokes came out forced. Attempts to distract him with talk of business or future plans fell flat. Inside his mind, only one loop played. Images of Priscilla flickered through his thoughts like scenes from a private film. He saw the shy girl in Germany. He saw the young woman walking into Graceland with uncertain eyes. He saw the new mother holding their baby with a look of awe and fear. He saw the wife sitting on the edge of their bed, telling him she was leaving because she could not breathe. Every version of her held the same pair of eyes. Questions filled the space between those images. He wondered if there had been a moment when he could have chosen differently and changed everything that followed. He wondered if one more promise, kept instead of broken, might have kept her in his life in the way he had once imagined. Self-blame and self-defense argued inside his head until dawn. Little sleep came. Restless packing took over. At times he picked up the phone, tempted to call her and say something he could not quite shape into words. At other times, he set the phone down with a harsh movement, angry at himself for feeling so exposed. Morning arrived anyway. Sunlight had no interest in his emotional state. Its simple duty was to climb up over the horizon and touch the city. On any other day, the brightness might have felt like a fresh start. On this day, it felt like the spotlight that precedes a performance he had never wanted to give. Preparation for court looked nothing like preparation for a concert, yet both carried ritual. Clothes had to be chosen with care, hair needed attention, the outer picture had to send a message, even if the inner chaos could not be controlled. People around him spoke in practical tones about timing, routes, security, and press presence. The ride to Santa Monica felt longer than it actually was. Traffic moved, buildings passed, streets blurred. Every turn of the tires brought him closer to a door where he would walk in as a married man and walk out with a new label. Memory worked against him, playing scenes of their life together over the view outside the window. Questions that had not found answers in the dark repeated themselves in daylight. What would her face look like when he saw her in that setting? Would her eyes be cold? Would there be anger left? Would there be softness? Could he bear to see indifference if that was what waited for him? Cars eventually slowed near the courthouse. Crowds had already gathered. Reporters set up their equipment, eyes sharp for the first glimpse of the man whose music had defined an era. Fans stood behind barriers, some holding cameras, some holding records, some just wanting to say that they had witnessed this day. He knew how to walk through attention. Years of red carpets, premieres, and stadium entrances had taught him how to carry his body when lenses pointed his way. Usually he drew strength from that skill. On this morning, every step felt like an effort to lift something heavier than his own frame. When the door of his car opened, sound hit him first. Voices called his name, questions flew, commands for him to look one way or another mixed with the murmur of onlookers who had never expected to see him like this outside of a movie scene. His mouth shaped a polite expression. His feet found the stairs. One part of him operated on habit, another waited for the moment he both dreaded and needed. That moment arrived when another car pulled up and stopped. Priscilla stepped out into the light with a kind of calm that did not come easy. Clothes chosen for the day sat neatly on her body. Hair framed her face in a style the public already knew. From a distance, she looked like a woman prepared to handle a public ending with dignity. The distance closed. As she walked closer to the steps, the crowd shifted. Attention turned toward the pair. Cameras adjusted their focus. A murmur rose up as people realized they would see both of them in the same frame one more time. Their eyes met. In that instant, everything else dropped away for him. What he saw on her face in that second did not belong to headlines or gossip. Sadness lived there, but it did not crush her. Strength held her shoulders, but it did not harden her into stone. A piece of the girl from Germany still flickered in her eyes, mixed now with the insight of a woman who had survived more than most people would ever understand. His body made a choice before his thoughts had time to argue. Feet moved toward her, hands reached out. Years of training for public life could not override the impulse that surged up from a place deeper than pride. Somewhere inside him, a simple truth spoke louder than all the noise. He loved her, he had failed her. He would not let the last public image of them be distance. When he took her hand, the contact burned through layers of formality. Skin on skin reminded both of them of 1,000 private moments that no camera had ever captured. Without pausing, he drew her close and kissed her. Gasps rose from the crowd. Reporters shouted questions with renewed urgency. Flash bulbs burst like small explosions. Commentators would later freeze that moment and offer 100 interpretations. Some would see a performance. Others would see proof that their bond had never really broken. None of them heard the unspoken sentences that moved inside that kiss. For him, the gesture held apology he could not put into words. For her, the gesture held a strange mix of gratitude and sorrow. That second carried the weight of promises betrayals, shared joys, and shared wounds. Their lips met once as husband and wife in public for the last time. Hands did not cling when they let go. Faces turned back toward the courthouse door. Officials signaled that it was time to enter. They walked side by side toward the building, a picture of calm to anyone who did not know how hard their hearts pounded. Inside the courtroom, the script belonged to the legal system. Judges, clerks, and lawyers followed procedure. Papers were presented, terms were read, questions were asked and answered. The language of love and regret did not appear on any document. Instead, there were numbers, property divisions, custody arrangements, and phrases that reduced a life together into lines on a page. Seats separated them. Priscilla sat with her representatives. Elvis sat with his. Physical distance in that room matched the emotional distance that had grown over years. Yet during pauses in the proceedings, his eyes found her profile. Glances revealed more than legal terms. At one point, she looked up and met his gaze. No challenge lived in that look, no victory, only a tired understanding that they had brought themselves to this place through choices both had made. The slight nod she gave him in that moment held more tenderness than any dramatic scene could have shown. Signatures closed the case. Pens moved, ink dried. An official voice confirmed what everyone in the room already felt. The marriage of Elvis and Priscilla Presley was dissolved under the law. That sentence landed in the air with a flatness that insulted the complexity of what had been real between them. Walking out of the building proved harder than walking in. Reporters had new questions, fans had new stories to tell, commentators had fresh material to analyze. The kiss on the steps became an instant subject of debate, captured in photographs that would travel across the world and through decades. Elvis stepped back into the daylight as a divorced man. Noise swelled again. People wanted to see his face now that the judge had spoken. They searched for traces of heartbreak, arrogance, relief, or regret. Whatever they saw depended on what they wanted to believe about him. The car door closed around him and sealed out the chaos. Silence filled that small space in a way that felt even louder than the crowd. Adrenaline drained, performance mode shut down. The reality of what had just happened settled onto his chest with crushing weight. Thoughts raced back to that first meeting in Germany once more. The distance between that shy girl and the woman who had just walked away from the courthouse seemed impossible to measure and painfully small at the same time. One moment of seeing her face had started a love story. Another moment of seeing her face had ended a chapter of that story in front of the entire world. Pain did not stay on the courthouse steps. In the months that followed, the impact of that day seeped into everything else in his life. Songs took on different meanings. Rooms felt emptier. Choices about his health, his career, and his relationships carried the shadow of that kiss and the knowledge that some losses cannot be reversed. Fans would watch the footage again and again. Many would smile at the sight of that unexpected tenderness. Many would insist it meant they never really let go of each other. Many would say the kiss proved that, behind everything, there remained a connection that no paper could erase. Very few would understand how much of his final years were shaped by the split second when Elvis Presley saw Priscilla's face on those courthouse steps and reacted without thinking. That reaction did not save the marriage. It did not change the documents. It did something quieter and more lasting. It revealed, in one clear motion, the truth about a man who could stand in front of thousands and still be undone by one look from the person who had seen him when all the lights were off. For most people, the story ends on the courthouse steps. History freezes that kiss into a single image that can be printed, framed, shared, and argued over. One photograph shows Elvis tilting toward Priscilla, their hands joined, mouths close, faces softened by something the camera cannot quite name. Another angle captures them walking in side by side, as if the day ahead is simply another public event. Magazines ran that photograph with bold captions. Newspapers used it as proof that there was no bad blood. Fans clipped the picture and tucked it into scrapbooks, happy to believe that, even in divorce, their love had stayed gentle. Life refused to stay that simple. Out beyond the borders of that image, days continued to unfold. A man who had just watched his marriage end still had to go on stage, still had to sign autographs, still had to pick up a phone and act as a father to a little girl who did not understand why her parents now lived in different homes. Crowds did not see those moments. They saw the kiss, replayed it in their minds, and wrote their own endings. Inside Elvis, that second on the courthouse steps did not close a chapter. It opened a wound he carried into every room he walked into afterward. Fame had always taken pieces from him. That day took something he could never retrieve. Later nights found him alone with the past. Hotel rooms, tour buses, and quiet corners of Graceland all became places where memory played louder than any record. Images of Priscilla at different ages appeared without warning. The young girl in Germany, the bride in white, the mother supporting their child, the woman sitting on the edge of their bed, explaining why she had to go. Finally, the face on the courthouse steps that looked at him with sadness and strength at the same time. Certain pictures stayed close enough to touch. One stack of photographs might sit on a table, waiting for him to sift through them in restless bursts. Another image would lean against a lamp, placed there by his own hand, as if he wanted the reminder to follow him from chair to chair. Each glance at those faces carried questions he never quite answered. Regret has a way of speaking without words. Even when he did not talk about the divorce directly, the weight of it showed in small ways. Friends noticed how often he fell silent when conversations turned to family. Band members sensed a deeper ache in particular songs. A slow ballad about lost love no longer felt like just another number in the set. It sounded like something he was trying to make true again for himself. Audiences heard power. Many did not hear the apology hidden inside it. While his body fought through exhaustion, the connection to Priscilla remained. There were calls about Lisa, visits to see their daughter, exchanges that required them to stand in front of each other without the structure of lawyers and judges between them. Those meetings carried their own quiet storms. Seeing her in those later years always stirred the same reaction, even if the gestures were smaller. A simple greeting at a doorway, a brief conversation in a hallway, a shared smile at something their child did or said. Each encounter reminded him that no matter what papers claimed, some ties do not fully break. Eyes gave everything away. Whenever their paths crossed, he searched her face for clues. Was she happier now? Had the weight that once sat on her shoulders lifted? Had the girl who used to watch him so intently from across rooms found a way to watch her own life instead? Answers did not come in speeches. Sometimes a relaxed smile suggested relief. On other days, a flicker of old pain crossed her expression before she smoothed it away. In front of Lisa, both parents tried to show unity and warmth. Behind that effort sat the complicated truth that they were still learning who they were without each other. Years moved faster than anyone expected. As his health declined, the castle he had built around himself began to crack. Reports later would focus on the dramatic parts, the pills, the weight, the erratic behavior. Underneath those headlines lived a human being whose heart still flinched every time the past appeared in the mirror. Questions about whether he had found peace before the end circle his story like birds that never land. Perhaps real peace never fully arrived. Perhaps moments of it broke through like sunlight between clouds, especially when he was with Lisa, or when music carried him somewhere above all the noise. Legacy tends to simplify people into symbols. For some, Elvis remains the unstoppable king of rock and roll, always young, always wild, always bending a microphone stand under hot stage lights. For others, he is the tragic cautionary tale, a man crushed under the weight of his own fame and the decisions that fame demanded. The truth sits somewhere between those extremes. He was a son who never fully healed from losing his mother. He was a dreamer who chased sound and spirit through every studio he entered. He was a husband who loved hard and failed deeply. He was a father who adored his child and feared that his flaws would swallow her world. Through all of that, one constant shaped him more than people realize. Elvis Presley learned to read faces long before he learned to read music charts. As a boy in church, he watched older folks close their eyes when songs touched something real. As a young singer on stage, he gauged which moves made teenagers scream and which notes drew them closer in silence. Later, on movie sets and television specials, he studied the reactions of directors, partners, and audiences, always searching for that spark that meant he had landed exactly where he needed to. Faces told him if he belonged. Crowds at concerts became rivers of expressions he could surf for hours. Workers backstage became mirrors that reflected his energy back to him. Strangers in restaurants, fans in airports, reporters with sharp questions all gave him feedback through the smallest shifts in their eyes and mouths. Among all the faces he learned to read, one held more weight than any other. Priscilla's expressions charted his life in a way no chart can show. When she looked proud, he stood taller. When hurt crept into her features, guilt rose in his chest. When resignation dulled her gaze, he felt a kind of dread that no spotlight could push away. That is why the courthouse moment mattered so much. When he stepped from the car that morning, part of him expected to see coldness. Another part feared anger. The deepest fear was that he would see nothing at all, that her face would close down into pure formality and leave him standing in front of a stranger. Instead, he saw something that complicated everything. Softness still lived in her eyes, not the soft innocence of a teenager, but the soft understanding of someone who had walked through fire with him and come out carrying scars instead of hate. Sorrow shared space with a kind of determined grace. It said very clearly that she had chosen a path that did not include him as a partner, but it did not erase the years they had given each other. His heart reacted before his mind could. Looking back now, that single movement toward her on the steps reveals more about who Elvis really was than any staged performance could. This was not a man calculating publicity. This was a man whose entire life had been driven by instinct. When music hit him, he moved without rehearsal. When grief struck, he poured it into melody. When love flashed before him in the shape of a familiar face, he reached out in front of the world and held on, even as the world told him it was time to let go. That is the man many people miss when they talk about him. Easy jokes focus on the jumpsuits, the jokes about excess, the collapse. Deeper stories know about his generosity, his love for gospel, his constant search for something holy inside the noise. Hidden inside that courthouse kiss is a piece of the man who could never fully separate his private heart from his public actions. Years after his death, Priscilla continued to speak about him in interviews. Words chosen in those settings carried care. She described his gentleness, his struggles, his humor, and his pain. Each time the subject turned to their relationship, her face shifted in ways that long-time fans recognized. A certain half-smile would appear. Eyes brightened when she remembered early joys, then clouded slightly when late years came into the story. No matter how much time had passed, emotion still walked across her features whenever his name left her mouth. People who loved Elvis watched those interviews closely. Many could not explain why they felt tears rise when she spoke about him, even when the words themselves remained calm. The answer lives in the same place as that courthouse moment. Some connections do not vanish with distance or paperwork. They transform, settle, and linger in the expressions of those who lived them. Modern fans discover the footage in a very different world. A clip of that day plays on a screen years after everyone in the original scene has moved on. Comments line up underneath, full of theories and reactions. Some viewers focus on what Elvis did. Others focus on how Priscilla responded. A few pay attention to the brief look they share before the kiss. Different people see different things. Romantics claim the kiss proves that they never stopped loving each other. Realists argue that it shows mutual respect more than passion. Cynics suggest that both knew the cameras were there and acted accordingly. Each view says as much about the viewer as it does about the couple. However, a quieter truth sits under all of that debate. For one brief second, the king of rock and roll stood not as an untouchable icon, but as a man who recognized the face that had been his anchor through some of the hardest years of his life. Every choice, every mistake, every tender moment, every failed promise compressed into that instant. Time cannot rewind what followed. Their lives moved on separate tracks. She built her own path, her own identity, her own work. He continued to perform until his body could not keep up with his soul. The world mourned him. She carried forward as the keeper of a legacy that belonged to millions, and also, in a very private way, to her and their daughter. That final look on the courthouse steps remains one of the only moments where millions get to see their story break open in real time. Watch closely, and something becomes clear. Elvis Presley was not simply a star who burned out. He was a man whose greatest strength and greatest weakness came from the same place. His heart moved first, thought came second. That pattern created masterpieces and heartbreak in equal measure. When he saw Priscilla's face that day, that pattern played out one last time in the most human way possible. Perhaps that is why this moment still matters. Every time someone presses play on that old footage, the echoes of a young girl in Germany and a young soldier with too much on his shoulders rise up again. The kiss at the courthouse is not only a symbol of a love story that changed shape. It is a reminder that even legends are vulnerable to the power of one familiar face. Long after the music stops, that truth remains. If this moment between Elvis and Priscilla struck something in you, share it. Tell us what you see in their eyes at that courthouse. Was it goodbye, apology, habit, or something that words cannot catch? If you want more deep dives into the hidden, human moments behind Elvis's legend, like this video, subscribe, and join the conversation in the comments below.